Hello, I'm Doug Musio. This is City Talk. American radio dying a slow death? Black and progressive radio becoming extinct? Is there life after drive time talk radio? And why you shouldn't always eat your oatmeal? To talk American radio, progressive radio, black radio, and oatmeal is Mark Riley. Mark has been in the radio business 30 plus years, recently on WWRL's Morning Drive Talk program. He hosted Air Americans, a 4-hour evening news, interview, comment, and culture program. He was a broadcast journalist, program director, and on-air personality at WLIB. In his career, he's interviewed everyone from Bill Clinton, Cornel West, Michael Bloomberg, Max Roach, Nelson Mandela, and so on. He is president of Mark Riley Media, where he writes about everything. Welcome, Mark.
Doug, this is a real pleasure.
It's a real pleasure for me, too. I mean, this is really a bit of role reversal.
It certainly is.
You used to call me up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and we'd BS on the phone for 15 20 minutes, yeah. 20 minutes at a pop. Okay, slow death. You're writing a book, The Slow Death of American Radio. What's the evidence and what's the nature of this slow death?
The evidence is subjective, and it comes from me, who's somebody who's been in the radio business for 40 years, and who has enough muscle memory left to remember the freedom I had doing radio 20, 30 years ago. Now, I should say that I always hated the idea that people older than me would come to me and say, oh, you remember what it was, how it was? No, you don't remember how it was during my day. It was so much better. But radio has been caught in a trap for about the last 20-odd years.
Go ahead.
And it's a trap that revolves around money. It revolves around the large corporations that now control so much radio. And it revolves around a notion that you can kind of use personalities as musical chairs in the radio business.
Explain all of that, but start with the last, this musical chairs.
Well, I mean, look at what's going on now between Cumulus, which owns WABC and some of the other outlets here.
Right.
And Clear Channel,
right,
which owns, LTW, Light FM, all those channels.
Right.
So what ended up happening was Clear Channel bought WOR,
right,
which had been owned by the Buckley family, and many.
This is part of these mega deals, media.
What happened was several of the talk show hosts, Rush Limbaugh and others, who were on the Cumulus station,
right,
WABC,
right,
were syndicated by Premier Networks, which is part of Clear Channel. So what ended up happening was they, Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, a couple of other people, moved from ABC to OR. And now Cumulus, which owns ABC, is developing its own group of people, including Curtis and Kuby. They brought them back, that kind of thing. And this happens in formats and on stations, not just in talk, all over the country. So all formats.
So you're talking about what? I mean, the churn, the celebrityfication, if you will? I mean, what's the problem?
The problem is that if you're not Rush Limbaugh or if you're not Sean Hannity, you become an interchangeable part
of the
radio business.
Okay.
You become somebody say, okay, well, we need to cut 5%. You're part of the 5%. And it doesn't matter what kind of work you're doing. It doesn't matter whether you even have ratings. If they say, well, we're looking to do something different, you're done. And the people that make those decisions are now, hate to say it, suits. And they don't know as much about the business as the people that made those decisions when I was coming up.
So it's all economic and doesn't really reflect content and mission other than making money. Is that what you're saying?
That's largely part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that radio, much like the music business, waited too long to understand what digital media was really all about. So they're now all playing catch up. So instead of spending money on talent, what they do is hire people who end up being called senior vice presidents in charge of multi-platform advocacy or multi-platform projection.
Oh, I want that title. I mean,
Yeah.
How much are we getting?
Good money.
Couple of $100,000?
Sure.
Hey.
Easy.
Better than what you were making.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Hey, come on.
And the thing is, I God love all of them, but they don't really have that much to do with the end product. Their thing is, well, let me take what I got and spread it across whatever platform that that my boss just discovered 3 weeks ago.
Okay.
And that to me is problematic.
Okay.
Because it takes away a couple of things. It takes away the freedom that I had coming up to kind of chart my own course in the radio business in terms of the stories that I covered, in terms of how I dealt with things. And it also, I think, has severely crippled the ability of people like me who came into this business at like 22 and didn't know anything and was able to learn and become knowledgeable and prosper. I don't think that's really available to a lot of people now.
Okay. What's the epitaph then to American radio that's dying the slow death, or black radio, or progressive radio?
Progressive radio has been particularly whipsawed.
Yeah, and in fact, let me step back a second. Your WWRL morning drive as both progressive radio and black radio. So
Sure.
just by way of definition, go ahead.
Well, the problem is that progressive radio always operated at a disadvantage. First of all, conservative radio had a 20-year head start. The other problem was that you had to have some bold, daring, innovative owners, or you had to go to one of the big boys and get some low-power AM stations that they didn't know what else to do with,
Right.
to start clearing progressive talk radio in the first place.
Okay.
All right, and little by little by little, there was, Air America was part of it, the success of people like Tom Hartman and Randy Rhodes and others who were syndicated, they were able to build a platform. But little by little, the platform is being dismantled. You look at LA, they took a
Right.
progressive talk station in LA, turned it conservative.
Right. And instead, they converted the station in San Francisco. You've got a
Same
lot.
thing. They turned.
Well, why is conservative talk radio ascendant? Not only the head start. What's the content? Is it more visceral? Why the attraction? Why can't liberals / progressives attract audiences the way the conservatives do?
A number of reasons for that. Some actually do, but they don't do it the same way. Tom Hartman, for example, has a huge number of affiliates, not all of which are terrestrial radio. He's got internet radio, he's got television, free speech, he's got a bunch of free speech TV, he's got a bunch of different...
So it's not only radio as I grew up with it and recognize it. You're saying that the liberals / progressives have gone multimedia?
Yeah, they have. I mean, and there's some people that are doing great stuff. Laura Flanders, who I think you know.
Yep.
Laura's a good friend.
Yep.
Laura has always done superior work on radio, on television, wherever she's been.
But the audiences, the numbers aren't there. Why?
The numbers aren't there to generate the advertising necessary to make it viable on terrestrial radio.
Okay. And in terms of corporate bottom line.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, what a lot of people do, and Tom has been really good at, he podcasts. He makes the money off his podcast. He's got one person who I happen to know who goes out and sells his podcast.
We could do that.
Yeah, we could do that.
Come on, let's forget about this.
We got to get a marketer to do that, because I am the world's worst marketer. Just ask my wife.
Oh, nice. Okay. Let's go to WWRL. I mean, in a sense, that's the most recent illustration of the slow death of progressive and black radio. And there's a real irony here with WWRL moving to, what is it, Mexican?
Regional Mexican, Spanish language program.
Okay. Who owns WWRL and why did they make this transition?
Okay, let me start by saying the people that own WWRL are some really good people. And I was there for 3 years. I have no grudges. I love folk who are over there. They're friends. What happened there was that they have a syndication company called Super Radio. Super Radio decided to roll out this regional Mexican format in 21 markets across the country. They needed New York to sell to agencies. Now, it almost doesn't matter the numbers they get, but they need to be on the air in New York in order to sell the format nationally and to national advertising.
Why WWRL?
Because that's the only outlet they have in New York. They had no choice.
Now, who owns WWRL?
It's Access One Communications.
And who owns Access One Communications?
Well, until a couple of years ago, it was a gentleman by the name of Sid Small, who I knew for a very long time. He died.
Wasn't this a black-owned?
Oh, yeah, it still
operation?
is.
It's still
is
a black-owned operation.
Yeah.
Is selling the black radio to Mexican radio. It's totally financial.
It's
Demography has nothing to do with this.
No, financial has to do with, this is a long story, but I might as well tell you. Because
Yeah, well, you can't do too long. Do it brief.
Access One is in the same situation that Clear Channel and many other radio groups are in. They got very heavily leveraged in the early part of the 2000s, borrowed substantial sums of money to expand, because at the time you had to expand or die. That's
Right.
what everybody was told.
Yep.
Well, over time, what happened was the money that was owed grew, and the money that was taken in was dying. By the time the radio,
And this is advertising revenue you're
Yes.
talking about. Go ahead.
radio revenue dipped a year and a half before the Great Recession. So radio was taking it on the chin every year, 3%, 5% declines. Well, the lenders got nervous. In some cases, the lenders weren't the same people that the folks had borrowed money from.
Right.
And they started calling their notes.
Right.
So then the question is, what do you do? Now, if you're big, like Clear Channel, you issue more stock.
Right.
You figure another way to get
Right.
around.
Yep.
Access One isn't that big. They don't trade publicly.
So just the economic environment, in a sense, forced them to do what
Something they might not have done under other
otherwise.
circumstances.
Okay. Talk about eating oatmeal.
All right,
Seriously.
this was my introduction to radio. Okay, many years. I was 7 years old. I hated oatmeal. I hate oatmeal to this day. My mother was one of those you eat what's on your plate people, period. And if you didn't, that was usually followed with a smack upside the head. My mother was old school before it was fashionable to be old school.
Some of us grew up under similar environments.
Yeah, so I had eaten oatmeal a couple times, couldn't stand it. So she puts a bowl of oatmeal in front of me one morning, and I said, I'm not eating it, which was, an extraordinary act of defiance on my part, because I didn't cross my
Maybe a
parents'
stupid act of rebellion, but go
Yeah,
ahead.
it was just, no, I'm not doing it. And my mother said to me, you will sit there until you eat that oatmeal. Now, this was at like 7:15, 7:30 in the morning, right? All she left me was a radio. There was a radio in the kitchen, because I was sitting at the kitchen table. There's a radio on the table. So the only thing she let me do was listen to WCBS, okay? And I sat there from 7:30 in the morning until the milk curdled about 5-something that afternoon, and heard
Ooh.
every single, in those days, they like The Edge of Night and some of these other programs were still on radio. They were 15-minute increments, and they had all of this really spooky, strange music
Sure.
in the background,
Sure.
organs and stuff. So I created this world for myself, sitting there, not eating this oatmeal. And had my mother had the sense to turn the radio off, I might have capitulated. But I didn't have to, because I
And
had
then
this
what would you have become?
Subway motorman.
Subway motor.
That was what I always wanted to do if I didn't do radio.
An honorable career. What was it like to do drive time? You worked, 6 to
6 to 9.
6 to 9 every day, 5 days a week.
Yes, sir.
What was it like? What was your routine? Talk about life as a drive time jockey.
Jockey?
Jockey.
Well, I would get up at 3 o'clock, and I would go through websites. I still kind of sort of do this, only a little bit later, but I would go through websites everything from the Hindu Times to the India Star to all of these different websites. I'd go through the Guardian and the Telegraph, then work my way through New York, and then if there was something jumping off on the coast that I saw on another website, I would go out to the LA Times. I would have and to this day, I have a really, really strong cup of Brazilian coffee.
Right.
Went along with this.
Right.
So I would leave my house about 4, drive into the city because there's no public transportation where I live, not at that time in the morning.
Me
Get
too. Once you're on the other side of the Hudson, forget it. Go ahead.
You're done. So I would get in, I'd go into the studio, go back over the stories I thought I'd want to do, cull them down to a manageable number, and then print them, and then read through them. And by 6 o'clock, I'd be ready.
And who's your audience? Beside my mother-in-law, for example.
The audience, see, talk radio always skews old. Talk radio's prime audience is 35 to 64. And I hate to say that because that's part of what I think is wrong with radio, is that they tend to put people in these niches based solely on age. I mean, they also put people in niches based on race and based on this and based on that. But age is the primary, demographics is the primary thing. You know, 6 plus, 12 to 17, 18 to 34, 25 to 54, 35 to 64. Of course, they overlap, but who's counting?
Right. The bean counters, but
Yeah,
go ahead.
our audience was heavily politically involved.
Not surprising given the nature of the
beast, yeah.
of the beast.
Yeah, and you know, they called. I learned a lot from this audience. They would call up and tell me about something I had not heard about previously.
Right.
Had to do the research sometimes during a commercial break. Thank God for Google and whatever else. And you know, ended up learning about stuff that I would not have ordinarily learned about. Even the people who called and disagreed. You know, I'd have people call from Sunset Park or from Staten Island. Some of the people on Staten Island, I was surprisingly progressive people. But you know, you would call
despite their appearances.
Well, despite the fact they come from Staten Island, because
right.
that's the stereotype.
Right,
Staten
exactly.
Island is full of conservatives.
Right.
No, it's not. But what's interesting to me, and this is something that, you know, my wife always yelled at me about. I have always believed that this city, 8 million, the metropolitan area, 15 million people, deserved good, thoughtful, local radio. Mm-hmm. And the trend in radio, and why I thought it was dying, was because it was going in another direction. Everybody was syndicated.
Right.
So even if you were based here, which several of them are, in Morning Drive, you couldn't talk about here.
Right.
You couldn't talk about the city council. You couldn't talk about you couldn't talk about that stuff. I got a chance to talk about that stuff. And my wife always, oh, you know, if you just, you know, open your mind to being syndicated. Well, I did syndicated radio with Air America. It was wonderful for a different set of reasons.
Right.
I got a chance to talk to a lot I talked to Dave Brubeck at one point, like a half hour on the phone.
I mean, you know, that's why I interview people on television.
Yeah.
It's because they're interesting
people. I mean, let me just share one story from Air America. I was working at night then, 8 till midnight.
Right.
And I interviewed Laurie Anderson, who was one of my favorite artists. Right. So, you know, we're talking, and I notice out of the corner of my eye, there's a figure in the control room who shouldn't be there. Because at that time of night, it's like 10:30 at night. There's nobody supposed to be there but the board op, right? So I see this figure just like walking around and pacing back and forth. And I was like, who in the world is this? So I'm thinking, like, when I go to commercial break, I got to ask the board, who is this? During the commercial break, the guy walks out of the control room, walks into the studio. It was Lou Reed.
Ooh.
It was just like, whoa, it's Lou Reed. You know, I didn't know that they were together at the time.
Right.
And
so you had surprises.
I had surprises, and that was a wonderful surprise.
What about callers? I mean, you had regulars.
I had regulars. I had a chance one time after a guy who I greatly admired passed away, and I had a chance. Laura and I were working together then. Had a chance to talk to Ani DeFranco.
Oh.
And, you know, I had become an Ani DeFranco fan some years early, because my taste in stuff is not what most people think. So I had seen her in Central Park a couple of times. So it turned out that the person who passed away, a guy named Sekou Sundiata, brilliant poet, had taught Ani poetry at one point.
So you're learning all this stuff.
I learned all this stuff. I talked to Mike Ditka, for God's sake, one time.
Oh, your type. Obviously, Mike Ditka's your type.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
So, sort of great moments. Let's assume that you were doing drive time today. What are we talking about? I'm calling you up. I want to talk stop and frisk. I want to talk Chris Christie. Let's start with Chris Christie. Let's start with our governor. I want to hear Mark Riley do a riff on Chris Christie.
Okay. And
You're on the radio.
My riff has been quite, it's changed a little bit.
Go ahead.
At first, when all this stuff jumped off, I believed Chris Christie that he didn't know anything about it. I thought it was a classic case of somebody trying to please the boss without telling the boss what they were doing to please the boss.
Sounds a little naive, but go ahead.
Well, I was willing to give him the benefit of that doubt,
go
even
ahead.
though I disagree with him about what time of day it was.
Okay.
Now, not so much.
Why?
Because I realized, this was where I was naive, because I should know better than this. Politicians, when they want something, when they have an ambition to do something, will lie if it suits their purpose.
This sounds like a newfound truth. Come on.
I know, but I mean, would lie about something that would be this injurious. See, I always thought Christie was too smart to have ordered something like this on the off chance. See, because if I were a politician, I'd be ultra conservative, at least as far as doing
Denials.
things that might hurt you.
Right.
Yeah. Anything you do, you got to have plausible deniability. Well, he treated this as a joke for the first 2-3 months.
Right.
Till the record over there in Jersey got a hold of
Yep.
the documents and the emails. Well, I always thought he was smarter than that. But then I also thought that Anthony Weiner was smarter than he turned out to be.
So the bottom line is assume that they're not smart.
Yeah, assume that their ambition overcomes whatever smarts they made.
Okay. Bill de Blasio.
He hasn't been ridiculously bad to start with. He really
Do
hasn't.
you expected him to be ridiculously bad?
Well, I didn't expect him to be.
Oh, okay.
But I mean, you got people in the media here who call him a commie, Sandinista, whatever. And
Yeah,
they
I mean,
expected him to be bad. The New York Post prints a story about the first month's worth of shootings. And like, where did you get that from? Who did you get that stuff from? And why didn't you put in that same article that the actual number of shootings had gone down? I mean, come on. But this is a journalistic trick I've come to expect. See, I may have been naive about certain politicians. I'm never naive about journalists, about people that work in the same business I worked in.
Yeah, okay. Some helpful hints from you about listening and watching the media. What are you going to warn the viewers about?
I'm not going to warn them about anything.
No.
I learned when I was in high school, I went to a really, really fabulous high school. And the one thing they taught me was to ask questions about everything. That's how I ended up doing what I'm doing indirectly. I would say to people who consume media, first, don't take one story from one publication. Look around and see how others cover the same story. And two, question everything. What are the motives? I mean, you've had situations before in this town where newspapers whose publishers or whose owners had a vested financial interest in a piece of real estate, they'd end up running a series of articles about how whoever was already there needed to go.
Right.
And the public doesn't know. The public's not paying attention.
Well, who's watching the people who are supposed to be doing the watching?
Well, there is fairness and accuracy in reporting. And they do a great job, but they're national. There's no watchdog in New York unless you've got people in talk radio who are willing to bring these kinds of things up. And, I'm not saying I did it all the time, and I'm certainly a flawed vessel, let's be real. But I know how this works. If after 40 years, I'd be an idiot if I didn't know how it worked. So for me, it's like, let me share with people how this actually works and why sometimes, for example, Doug, most people, and I questioned audiences all before the election about this. What was the greatest or not greatest, largest voter turnout in the modern history of the city of New York. What year?
I would guess 1989 in the Dinkins-Giuliani race?
Nope.
Boy, embarrass me.
1950, Vincent Impellitteri, 2.692 million
Wow.
voters turned out versus 1.9 for Dinkins-Giuliani.
Right, right.
The largest single turnout in New York City history. And most people don't even know who the hell Vincent Impellitteri was.
And they didn't know who he was when they voted for him.
That's true, because he took the office after O'Dwyer left.
That's exactly right. Okay. Crystal ball. 2-3 years down the road, what do you see as the sort of the talk media landscape? You got 30 seconds.
The talk media landscape is not, the players will not change that much unless they choose to retire. John Gambling, for example, just retired. There will be some younger people, that are coming up now that are syndicated, they're just not syndicated here. You will hear more about them, and they will be conservative in the main. Because this city, despite its history of liberalism, is in a market where there are conservative towns and cities all the way around it. And the way the ratings are polled, they don't take New York City separately. You can't get ratings for New York City separately.
Oh,
Dig and dig and dig. They call this, what was it, standard?
Metropolitan Statistical
SMSA,
Area.
yeah.
Right.
And that's 15 million people. And what it does is tend to take the percentages of blacks and Latinos much lower than it
Right.
would be if you looked
Like in
specifically
New York
at the city of
City,
New York.
right.
Well, until that changes, until New York gets a different sense of itself as a city, then you're always going to have talk radio. And remember, too, that most people in New York City take the subway back and forth to work. Most radio listening is done outside of the home and in cars.
Very interesting.
So, there is that dynamic to radio listening.
Oh, okay. We'll have to stop there. You're going to come back because I need to
Sure.
torture you more. My thanks to Mark Riley for bringing us up to date on the past and the future of our first love, radio. Join me next week here on CUNY TV. Excellent. Hello, I'm Doug Musio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.tv. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.